Hi, I'm Otto Diefenbach, and this is the instructional video for the Golf Minister Hover Guy. As you can see, one of the first things you need when you're handling Hover Guy is a table that has a soft top on it so it doesn't damage Hover Guy himself. The pilot of Hover Guy must be proficient in RC aircraft 3D hover with a Mode 2 transmitter. Let's do a walk around. As you can see, I have Hover Guy on his back. He's 6 foot 3 inches in height and 4.5 pounds with his batteries installed. You have the upper torso and the two legs detach. I'm going to roll him over and we'll get into some more detail. When I face him on his nose, I take care to make sure that his head hangs over the table so that you don't injure his nose. Starting from the head end, of course, you have the two battery locations, and of course the top of the head comes off and you have the top of the head connected to the main body with magnets. This is allow access for connection of the batteries prior to flight. As we move back, right here you have the flight controller. The flight controller adds stability to the aircraft, and of course the motors with the special 3-blade propellers. In addition to that, you have two electronic system controllers here, one for each motor. They control the speed of the motor. And then up front, covered with the vinyl, you have two BECs, one at 5 volts for the receiver and the controller, and one at 6 volts for the 4 servos. You can also see the receiver here buried in the foam. You have two servos, high-tech HS 645s, buried up here in the shoulders. Those control the rudder motion, one for each leg. Now as we move to the back of the aircraft, now this is the mounting for each leg. What we have is the servo connection to the Elevon servo. You have one on each leg, and that controls the motion up and down of each leg. In addition to that, you have a zip tie on each electrical connector. That zip tie is there to make sure that the electrical connector doesn't come apart. In addition, we have a screw, a Phillips head wood screw on both legs. That holds the pivot pin in place. It's a carbon fiber pivot pin, and if you move the camera up, you can see that the pivot pin comes out through these two holes in his back. Now I've provided vinyl, plenty of vinyl to cover these holes for any performances that you do. Just be careful not to leave the vinyl on for more than a few days, or else it will make a permanent adhesion to the rest of the vinyl. As we're also walking around the legs, you can see the servo connection here from the rudder, and that controls the yaw motion of each leg. That must be disconnected, the pin must be pulled, and the connector disconnected to remove each leg. This is the lower half of the internal shipping container for the Golf Minister Hover Guy. As you can see, the legs and the torso, the transmitter, batteries and charger are all contained within this unit. Each of the legs lifts out, and you can see up here on the corner I've color-coded one leg with a red tip so that you know which leg is which. And then again, you have the torso in the center. Over on this corner marked is the transmitter and transmitter location. Their batteries and charger will be integrated into this corner too. I've only had one day to get to this point on building the shipping container. The shipping container will be about 20 inches deep and 43 inches in one dimension and 40 inches in the other. The torso just lifts right out. You got to be careful. I have broken one hand off but that was back when it was a lot tighter than it is now. But just wiggle it and the torso lifts right out. These are the tools that are required to assemble Hover Guy. First you need a flat blade large screwdriver, a small Phillips head screwdriver, you need 2 small zip ties and some clippers to clip the ends once the zip ties are installed, a pair of scissors, and some of the material that I've sent you that can be used to cover the holes where the hinge pins are inserted for the rear legs. Okay, the first stage in putting them together is to assemble the legs. As you'll notice, I've color-coded one side red. When you put him on his nose or on his belly, make sure that his head is hanging over the edge of the table so you don't flatten his nose. Take your Phillips head screwdriver and remove the hinge pins that are inside the body. There are 2 small Phillips head screws, and the hinge pins come out through the holes in the back. As I mentioned, one side is color-coded red. Not only the support frame has a red spot, but also the hinge pin itself has a red end to it. There you can see the top of the red hinge pin and the red marking on the location where the hinge pin is inserted. And as mentioned, I have one leg that has a red tip that lines up with the red hinge pin and the red insert point. Now, what I like to do first is come in with the hinge pin, put it into the hole in the frame, then work that into the pivot tube that's on the leg, and then I work the hinge pin down into the pivot, and this is the tricky part of the leg insert, is making sure you get the bottom in the bottom hole. Just takes a little patience. See that there's a hole. You move the rod over to the hole and you push the hinge pin in, and that is complete except for tightening the little Phillips head screw at the top. And you come up and you just tighten that in to secure that leg pivot. Now the next step is to take your big flat bladed screwdriver and attach the clevis. I spread the clevis and insert the clevis on the hole, and that's attached. Now the final thing to do for this particular leg is to take and connect the connector. You'll notice on the connector on both ends there's a yellow side. Make sure the yellow side's aligned. Fully press in the connector. Then take one of the zip ties, loop it around, and this is just to prevent the connector from ever coming apart during a performance. And tighten that zip tie down. And then take the clippers, the small clippers, and just clip off the end. Process is repeated for the other side. It only is difficult in that you have to work around the leg you've already installed. Sometimes it's easier to come in and actually attach the clevis first on the second leg. There we go. And once you have the clevis done, then the next thing is to put in the pivot pin. just as you put in the pivot pin on the other side. First of all, you put it through the hole in the frame, and then put it down through the pivot tube, push it down, and then align the bottom. And then push it through, and then come back with your Phillips head screw and screwdriver and secure the pivot pin in the frame. I've included an extra screw in case you lose one. They're a fairly standard but small Phillips head screw. Okay, everything's complete on this side except for connecting the connector. Again, always be careful to attach yellow to yellow. If you put it in backwards, the servo just won't work. So if you do fire it up and you find the servo doesn't work, most likely you plugged in the plug backwards. But get it yellow to yellow, then take, as we did the first time, your zip tie and secure the connector so it won't come apart during operations. Like so. And again, this is just a precaution. Probably would never come apart, but safety comes first. Now the final part of this whole procedure is covering the holes that were used to insert the pivot pins. What I do is I cut myself 2 squares out of this vinyl material that he's covered in. And one caution is don't leave the vinyl material on for weeks. If you do, it'll become permanently attached and you'll have to cut a new hole and start over with new vinyl material. Why, again, I've given you plenty of vinyl material so you can cut new patches every time you take the legs off and put the legs on. Again, I cut a little square that's larger than the hole and cut the corners off. So essentially I make an octagon, but not a perfect one. And then I just lay the vinyl material. Hopefully I don't put a wrinkle in like I just did. The great stuff is you can peel this stuff back off. Again, as long as it's not been sitting on there for weeks or days. The glue becomes activated either by any kind of heat. If you leave him out in the sun for an extended period of time, it'll be difficult to get these off. I have found even after it's been on for a while, if you carefully take a razor blade, you can get under the edge and pull it off. The danger is that you might take some of scratch the printing on the vinyl. One other thing that I have done since the early videos that we shot, we've done a lot of experimental flying, and we've discovered that moving the center of gravity back, again the balance point for him to the rear, has improved his hover handling. It has slightly degraded his regular flight performance, but a good radio control pilot who can do 3D hover with a standard airplane with aircraft control should have no problem flying Hover Guide. And let me briefly show the 2 battery attach points, battery locations. Originally I had the batteries up in this location. They have been moved. One is now on the center rail, held in with a strap. The other one is embedded in the front underneath the flight controller. You can see the 2 plugs that are provided, and these plugs are the plugs for attaching the power to the system. Again, one thing you want to make sure is once you have power in the system, Stay very clear of these props. When you power up, you attach these and take them apart. Make sure that the transmitter obviously will be at low throttle, but make sure nobody is touching it or playing with it, and there's no potential for somebody to raise the throttle while you have your hands in here, either attaching or disconnecting the power plugs. Other than that, we're essentially ready to install the batteries and plug everything in and fly. We'll go through the battery install next. Hover Guy flies with two batteries. They're both 1800 milliamp hour 4S batteries. These are 65C lithium polymer A-spec batteries available from Hobby King. You can get these in Europe. You'll have two sets of flight batteries, and I recommend you get some extra sets. First battery is installed behind his chest, or behind the controller in his chest. You undo the strap here that covers the battery compartment. You insert the battery, and then restrap it. Take the strap and securely cinch it down so it is fully installed. Now you have the power plug that plugs into this plug on the flight vehicle, or on Hover Guy. The second battery is installed on this support structure. It's installed with the battery connector down or toward his front. You open up the strap, loosen it, you can slide it in, and then you cinch it down. There are two little pieces of wood glued at either end to keep the battery from shifting, and then this one plugs into this plug receptacle for flight. And let's walk through the power up sequence. Okay, to power him up, as I mentioned earlier, you connect the two batteries, but it's always nice to have helping hands around to hold him securely so that nothing moves and you have complete control of the situation. Also, it's good to have that person that's holding him while you power him up also be the person that is the launcher or the handler. But to power them up, again, always turn the transmitter on first. As we've walked through before, all the switches on the front face of the transmitter should be up, and all the switches on the top of the transmitter should be back to be in proper position. When it comes up and says Bjorn, and it will show a helicopter, even though the flight controls are set up like an airplane, where this is roll, this is pitch, and this is yaw. So when he's flying in hover, this is yaw, this is pitch, this is roll. Okay, so I will now power him up. Now, everything is connected in parallel. The whole system is run on what's called 4S or 4-cell. So when I power them up, both electronic controllers for both motors will get power. And what you'll hear is 4 beeps, which tells you have 4S, and then you get the second sound or tone, which tells you that the receiver is reading the transmitter. If you looked down here on the controller, it would say safe on the screen. It's a difficult shot to get, but if you look with your eyes, you'll be able to see that. And what that means is not that the system's safe. Now, of course, before you fly, you want to always plug in both plugs. And as I mentioned, make sure that the transmitter is clear and nobody can hit the throttle. But connect both plugs so you have the power of both batteries. Again, they run in parallel. Make sure there's nothing that's going to hit a prop. And at this point, the motors are actually armed. That's why you got to be very safe. And at this point, to actually arm the flight control system, you go full right on the aileron, and you can see now I have control of the legs right and left. I have up and down, and then I have yaw. So he is fully ready to fly. and the head is the nose of the aircraft. So when he is actually flying in 3D hover with his head up, it's essentially the same as a model aircraft hanging on its prop in 3D hover, and all the controls are identical. This is the Spectrum DX6i transmitter that I'm providing with the Golf Minister hover guy. Essentially, to fly and in transportation, always check to make sure the switches are in the correct position. All the switches should be forward or up or to the back. And if all the switches are in those locations, everything is good. This is your throttle stick, and a good hover is just a little bit above 50% on the stick position. That is actually 75% of your total power available. This is your rudder control, this is your roll control, and this is your pitch control. Again, we're talking like an airplane. So that when you're in hover, this is forward, this is back, this is right, this is left in movement and hover, and then this is the roll control, which pivots him around. Now if I turn on the transmitter, you'll see it comes up in model number 2, Bjorn, and it comes up in a helicopter mode. The reason I set this all up in a helicopter mode is so that we could use a throttle curve, and that allows us at 50% stick to have 75% of the total throttle available. So don't be concerned because a helicopter comes up and not an airplane. You still fly him like an airplane. As mentioned a little earlier, on the KK Mini controller, flight controller, and in the transmitter, everything is sent to you set up perfectly. Please only let somebody that's very experienced in the RC industry mess with the transmitter setup, and I really recommend nobody touch the KK controller. If you start touching the KK controller, you're only going to create problems. Okay, I'm going to initialize by plugging in the battery. And now I'm going to actually arm the system, which allows the flight controls to operate according to the controller. One thing to note is that the way I have it set up is that the throttle is always armed. So be careful around the props once you have any power on the system. Okay, I'm going to disarm now, and I should probably go through that. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm plugging in one battery to provide power to the system. You hear the ESCs go through the beep, 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 and then the second tone is actually the controller recognizing the receiver. On occasion, at the very first time that the receiver sees the transmitter on a given flying day, that will take too much time for the flight controller, and the flight controller will give you an error message on its screen. What you need to do in that case is actually unplug and then replug the power for everything to initialize properly. Now, we haven't armed the system in the sense that the legs are not usable right now for flight control, but I'm going to do a slight run up of the throttle, and you can see that the power is there and available, and these can hurt your fingers if you were to stick them in and somebody were to hit throttle. So careful coordination needs to be performed between the pilot, operator, and the launcher. Now let's go to the back of the aircraft, and here we are in the safe condition. Right now the flight controls do not work. You can see I'm moving the stick and nothing's happening. To arm, you take the roll control and you push it all the way over to the left. The legs will arm. Now to disarm, you push the roll control all the way to the right, and all of a sudden now I don't have control at all. To arm, you push it over to the left, and then the legs will deflect, and now I have all the control. Let me demonstrate the control. This is rudder to the left, or yaw to the left, yaw to the right, This is nose up or up elevator. This is nose down or down elevator. And then roll control is provided by elevons. This is left roll. This is right roll. Left roll, right roll, up, down, and left. And then right. And you need to be careful before you launch and you go through your control check, not, and I will emphasize this, not to disarm the system. If you disarm the system, you won't have any flight control. It is very important, and I'll repeat it because I have made the mistake myself, is to ensure that the flight controls, or the flight controller itself and the flight controls are armed prior to flight. And make sure that you check the controls, and since your throttle will be at idle, make sure that you do not hit full right roll control, because that will safe, again, the flight controller. You don't want it safe, but you want it armed. And the best way to do that is just arm it and just check your yaw control or your rudder control, and just make sure you have good leg movement. I can't stress enough to keep your hands clear of the props when it is plugged in, because the props are armed at all times. And there have been occasions, not with any of this, where people have accidentally hit the throttle by bumping it or whatever on the transmitter, and the props have started moving without desire for the props to be moving, and people have cut their fingers up fairly badly.